So I'm Stephanie D'Souza. Barry mentioned before some of the work that we're doing, of course, and one of them was the Kumanu Tangata study, or the aftermatch study, which is specifically looking at the health outcomes of high-level rugby union players involving linkage of a New Zealand rugby register to the IDI. And of course, you guys have probably seen this a few times. Mine's very big, but just the disclaimer there that this isn't, of course, official statistics, and what I'm showing here is my work, essentially. All right, so probably a lot of you are aware that there are increasing concerns over the risk for neurodegenerative diseases for athletes that are involved in contact and collision sports. With increasing attention in recent years towards rugby union. This includes both in the research and public spaces, as evidenced by media coverage, as you can see on the screen over there. Some of you may have seen, there was recently, in fact, a 60 Minutes, I think, special on Carl Heyman up there, talking about his experience in being diagnosed with dementia and such. So there is this sort of increased interest, increased concern over the impact of playing contact sports such as rugby union over the life course. And so for that reason, it's important to understand the long-term health outcomes over playing such contact sports. And of course, physical activity is beneficial for well-being, we know this, but then there's also repeated head impacts that many contact and collision sports athletes are exposed to that may likely increase the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. So, to be able to investigate such health outcomes, it's important to have large-scale longitudinal studies. This is because outcomes such as neurodegenerative diseases are rare. They can take a while to develop. So having a large sample size, being able to look at the outcomes in the context of the population, and having a long follow-up are really important for research and for understanding their development. And this is where linking to longitudinal administrative records, such as health records, can be useful. Researchers can track health outcomes from the end of an athlete's career, ideally for a long follow-up. Now, much of the previous research looking at contact and collision sport and health outcomes that have used large-scale administrative data have focused on American football, so the NFL, and association football, so soccer. And what these studies have typically reported is greater risk of neurodegenerative diseases and mortality attributed to neurodegenerative diseases in athletes when compared to the general population. In contrast, however, what they also see is a reduced risk of all-cause mortality, so that's death due to all causes, for these athletes relative to the general population. So you're seeing this sort of, I guess, beneficial effect of being an athlete, but then a risk in relation to neurodegenerative diseases in particular. Now, there's only one very recent longitudinal study that's used administrative data in rugby union players. So this was conducted by Russell and colleagues. And they had a Scottish sample of about 400 players compared to about 1,200 general population members. And what they observed were that players were less likely to die from all causes prior to the age of 70. But when they looked at the risk of neurodegenerative diseases, they did see that this was greater in terms of neurodegenerative disease-related death or a diagnosis. What, I guess in the context of this sort of research, it is a relatively low sample size, particularly when you're wanting to examine specific types of neurodegenerative diseases, because these can be quite rare. So this will be things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, etc. So in the case of Russell and colleagues, they looked at Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and motor neuron disease, /ALS. And because they had, I guess, a relatively small sample size, their precision in their estimates they weren't able to have as precise estimates in quite large, essentially confidence intervals when looking at some of these kind of specific neurodegenerative diseases. So there is obviously a need for much larger scale research here. And then there's just another study by Beagle, Holt and Stewart, much older study, as you can see, that found no difference in life expectancy for All Blacks when compared to the relevant life expectancy tables. In terms of other health outcomes, this hasn't, so beyond neurodegenerative diseases that is, this hasn't been explored in great detail, with much of the research that has been conducted with rugby players limited to cross-sectional studies. So what these studies have generally found is a greater prevalence of osteoarthritis, so some musculoskeletal conditions, when compared to non-contact sports athletes, and a greater likelihood of hazardous drinking, again, compared to non-contact sport athletes. And then a 2018 systematic review that was conducted by Cunningham and colleagues, they observed mixed results when it came to self-reported mood and cognitive outcomes. So based essentially on the lack of research in this space, particularly for rugby union players, this motivated the development of the Kumanu Tangata study. So this is a collaboration between New Zealand Rugby and the University of Auckland, specifically Compass. And just some kind of initial background on it, the project name Kumanu Tangata was gifted by New Zealand Rugby's co-matua, Luke Crawford, and it comes from the phrase he tukutuku raronga he kumana tangata, which literally translates to a statistical lattice work, cherishing people, and figuratively translates to multiple data threads combining to care for our players. So essentially trying to capture that idea of using data essentially to look at the well-being of their players. And then aftermatch is that concept of, I guess, what lies beyond a professional sporting career, but then also after the match, you have that sort of opportunity for debrief and analysis. So trying to capture that here as well. So as I mentioned, we utilize the integrated data infrastructure to investigate a wide range of health outcomes using a considerably larger sample size than what's been done in previous research. So just to kind of reiterate, for those of you not familiar, the IDI is a population-based linked administrative database maintained by Stats New Zealand, of course, containing de-identified data on individuals from government and other sources, and of course includes relatively comprehensive health data. So New Zealand Rugby were able to arrange for the New Zealand Rugby Register to be linked to the IDI. So this was a register compiled by New Zealand Rugby historian Clive Akers, and it essentially contains a list of New Zealanders who played rugby at a first class level. So this was provincial or higher, and were active between 1870 and 2015. In terms of the linkage, we linked those who were active between 1950 to 2000 here, just based on what we could accurately link. And then we also, so this was about 16,000 records that were provided to Stats New Zealand, and this was linked via a fast match load rather than within their kind of traditional updating of data. And so we were able to get accurate linkage for about 85.7% of these individuals, about 13,800. And then we applied, you probably can't see it very clearly, but we applied some further exclusion criteria there. So this included restricting to those who were born from 1920 onwards, just because the birth records are more complete and reliable from that period. There were also there was evidence of some linkage errors in terms of incorrect sex and birth year mismatches, so we excluded those individuals and made sure that we restricted to those who were 18 at within our cohort. So this resulted in a final sample of 13,227 players who were born between 1920 to 1984. What we also then did was get a general population comparison group. So these were all males as well, because all our players were males. And we restricted it to those who were, again, born between those birth years, 1920 to 1984. And what you can see, so what this graph shows in green is essentially the percentage in terms of ethnicity and total response ethnicity and New Zealand born status of players, and then our general population comparison group is in black. And you can see that there are some clear demographic differences here. We also looked at birth year, and there were also demographic differences there, with our players tending to be older on average. So here our players were typically more likely to be European and Māori, and more likely to be New Zealand born compared to the general population. And because of these demographic differences, essentially, what we did was we weighted the non-players to match the players in terms of this distribution of total response ethnicity, birth year, and overseas New Zealand born status. And you can see after doing the weighting, which is the grey bars, this weighting essentially resulted in similar proportions for in terms of the distribution of these demographics across the players and the general population comparison group. So we were interested in several different outcomes of interest. Of course, neurodegenerative diseases. So these included Alzheimer's disease, other dementia, Parkinson's disease, and motor neuron disease. Musculoskeletal conditions, chronic conditions, so cardiovascular disease, cancer and diabetes, mental health outcomes, and then mortality. So mortality will also be looking at all-cause mortality, as well as certain cause-specific mortalities as well. And our plan is to essentially ascertain these diagnoses using primarily hospitalization and mortality records, because this is when we've got the sort of broadest range of data availability. Generally, in terms of diagnosis, information will be from 1988 onwards. And in some cases, we will also be exploring other sources, primarily pharmaceutical conditions, to see if we can capture more cases here as well. So I will just chat through the neurodegenerative disease results that we've observed. So I've got the kind of proportions up there in terms of how many people had a neurodegenerative disease. And again, in green, we've got the players, and in grey, we've got the general population. So we tracked individuals from 1988 to 2018, and over this period of 30 years, 4.7% of our players had a neurodegenerative disease diagnosis, and 3.9% of general population controls had a diagnosis. We then did some Cox proportional hazards analysis to essentially look at, so similar to what Arazu did before, some time to event analyses, to look at essentially the risk of developing these neurodegenerative diseases, with participants being tracked from the age of 30. So this was when most players had completed their professional career, with right censoring if they died or left the country without returning, or reached the end of the study period without a diagnosis. And what these analyses show is that when compared to males from the general population, players were more likely to be diagnosed with any neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias in particular, but not substantially more likely to be diagnosed with either Parkinson's disease or motor neuron disease. We also conducted sensitivity analyses, including pharmaceutical data, and these results essentially stayed the same. And we also accounted for non-neurodegenerative disease mortality as competing risks. And these, again, showed negligible impact on our results. We then also explored some player-specific characteristics as risk factors. So this is just focusing on players and looking at whether things like player position had an impact, so whether they were in forward positions or back positions. So forward positions typically tend to be the larger build players that would be more likely to be in a ruck, and you would think would be more likely to actually be kind of more physical in the sport. And level of play, which included professional or international level players. So the All Blacks, for example, would be in this sort of category. And then the other category here was provincial or amateur level players. And then we also looked at years played and the number of matches played as well. So for player position, what we observed, interestingly, were forwards were less likely to be diagnosed with any neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias than back position players. And there was no really observable difference when we looked at level of play. For number of years played and matches played, what we did was we estimated the linear effects for 8 years of play, that's on top, and 78 matches, which roughly corresponds to 2 standard deviations for these variables. So essentially to illustrate the risk between a typically short versus a typically long career. And what we see is while we have estimates of over 1 for years played, the confidence interval essentially crosses 1, saying we don't really have this sort of notable risk of, I guess, long in relation to years played. But when we look at matches played, we do observe an increased risk, particularly for any neurodegenerative disease and motor neuron disease in particular. All right, so just to conclude these results, of course, we do see an evidence of an increased risk of neurodegenerative disease amongst high-level rugby players. They are, I mean, it's hard to see, but they're all around the sort of 1.2, 1.5, or less than 2 in terms of hazard ratio. So the effect sizes aren't huge, but we are seeing an evidence of an increased risk. And, you know, that still means we need to highlight the ongoing need to prioritize player safety. In terms of next steps for this research, we've currently got the mortality outcomes, the results just being finalized, and the paper actually for this is hopefully going to be submitted soon, fingers crossed, with neurodegenerative diseases. And we've also got analyses underway for musculoskeletal outcomes. So just also some caveats, I guess, with this sort of work. We've had a few other people mention this, that there may be an undercounting of cases due to the reliance on service use data. We're, of course, primarily relying on hospitalizations or mortality records, and we're likely to not capture as less severe cases. And the fact that we also lack primary care data, where a lot of cases might get captured as well, is something we need to be aware of. And we also don't have a direct measure of exposure to rugby-related factors, things like repeated head impacts, for example. Another thing to be aware of is that rugby union became a professional sport from 1995 onwards. So what this means is our player cohort only included essentially 5 years in which rugby was a professional sport, so 95 to 2000. And there are many changes that have come about with professionalism. So this is things like increased training volumes, larger players, more frequent collisions, which again would be increasing one's risk for, you know, severe concussion and then neurodegenerative disease. So, we may observe different results if we were to look at a more recent cohort as well. And then finally, we don't have information on, I guess, the general population's exposure to other, to rugby or other contact sports to kind of adjust for that as well. And finally, just to wrap up, I just want to quickly thank my Kumanu Tangata colleagues, so Dr. King Corey from New Zealand Rugby, my PhD student Francesca Arns, who's done a lot of the work with the neurodegenerative diseases, Barry, of course, and Chow, who's been really helpful with a lot of the analyses from campus as well. World Rugby and New Zealand Rugby Foundation for funding this work. Statistics New Zealand, of course, for access to the IDI and for loading the rugby data into the IDI, and the Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland for letting us use their data lab. Great, that is it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
It's very interesting studies, especially with motor neuron disease. And my question is, with your control population, what's your base selection with your control population? You use the sensor data or?
Oh, yes. So we use the, so the question, sorry, was what was our, the base for our comparison population, and we use the resident population, the estimated resident population within the IDI over the, I guess from when we could estimate resident population from 2006 onwards, and we restricted it again to males and then to those that were born between 1920 and 1984 to be comparable to rugby players. Yeah, so it was the resident population, so not just those born in New Zealand and not just census members, but yeah.
And then you matched with the age group with rugby players, or?
Matched well, we restricted it to the same birth year as rugby player, the range for rugby players. Yeah. And then we used weighting rather than a many to one match approach to to sort of retain as many people as we could.
Yeah, and your diagnosis of disease, especially with neurodegenerative disease, so you use both mortality data, like mortality collection, and also hospital.
Yes, yeah. So for
both case and controls.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So we use mortality and hospitalizations to diagnose for ascertainment of diagnoses across both those cohorts. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Annie, yeah.
I was just curious, like, and you may have already said, like, what was the explanation for why there was like 3,000 or something people that couldn't be matched once you?
Yes, good. Did I say that? So we essentially what we did was there's a way to review the linkage, and I'm not clear exactly why. Essentially, they weren't linked to a UID, and that could be either because I don't know. It could be that they're not there, like perhaps they left before, or there's just not good enough data. Yeah. There's no way to know really, actually. Yeah.
My question is there any possibility of like using safety measures while playing rugby sports could be used to, I mean, in the model to confound it as when you were doing the analysis, like some of the players would already be using some safety, like a headgear.
Right,
And is there any way that you could do? Confound for that?
No, there's unfortunately not that level of detail. So we essentially only have, in terms of what variables we've got from the registers, essentially what we looked at. That's an interesting question. I don't think there'd be many that probably are using it to be able to get anything meaningful, and then there's nothing comparative. Oh, well, I guess you could do it within players. It's an interesting question too, and I think especially with changes in recent years, I think would be more meaningful. So hopefully, maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be able to look at it. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question. Sorry. Did you say that those who were playing in the forward position were actually less likely to have, those kind of conditions?
Yes.
So that means overall, it is not an issue. It's quite a good thing to play rugby, like even if they're physical, right?
Well, I think that was an unexpected finding, as I said, because you do expect forward positions to perhaps be more likely to be, tackling and injured, and they're the more kind of bigger physical positions. What we think might be happening here is that actually it could be the impact of collisions that are having an effect. So forwards might be just more in you know, in a ruck or something where they're not running and getting tackled and then having that. So backs might be having a sort of higher velocity impact that is actually maybe putting them more at risk. But this was something that I think hasn't really been looked at and was surprising to us as well. So yeah, I think it's something we need to look into a bit more to understand. But that could be what's happening potentially. Yeah, I can't say it's good or bad to play rugby, I guess, because you know there's obviously pros and cons to it. There is that risk, but as we've seen, and we'll look into it in terms of other outcomes, we might also see beneficial effects in terms of other physical health outcomes. Yeah. Yes, Barry.
Just building on that, all of those findings were small, including that one. Right?
Yes.
So the difference between forwards and backs is a difference. It's the technical, but still not a very big one.
Yeah.
It's like doubling the risk or halving the risk.
Yeah, there was something like 0.83 in terms of the hazard ratio. So yeah, not very big effects in terms of what we're seeing. Yeah.
Thank you again for the presentation. Just in terms of, I understand that the majority of your participants are male, but has this triggered any considerations for future investigations or in terms of the new interest of females?
Yeah, good question. We haven't, I'm not sure what their recording of female level data, I'm sure they'll have some level of it. It would be, I would say, fairly new and not a large record, but it is an interesting question. I think it's something that we see sometimes in absence of females in some health, you know, studies as well. So this will be relevant there too, and I'm curious. You know, I think it would be something that we should look at. But yeah, with our data, unfortunately, we can't. Yeah, but it's a good question. Thank you.
So what was your average follow-up time?
Good question. So I cannot recall off the top of my head. We followed them for 30 years. Was it 27? Do you remember?
It's really close to 30 because most
Yes.
of the players were 30 by the time we started following them up in 1988.
Yeah.
So I can't actually report average.
I think we do, but sorry, we have actually quite a lot of. I didn't only show a small proportion of it, but we have a few things that we looked at.
Pretty close to 30.
Yeah.
So it's around 65, 57.
Well, the oldest ones are, we focused, it'll be 98 at the end of the follow-up period.
Yeah.
Would you be looking at the relationship between food diet and neurodegenerative diseases in players? Some people consider that food is the contributor to such issues.
Good. Yeah, we don't have that level of detail, unfortunately, with what we're looking at. It is an important consideration. I think food also, one thing that we've discussed amongst our team is also things like alcohol use. I think there was also probably in older generations heavy alcohol or drinking culture that could have contributed. We've heard, I think, some of the players as well that have, like Carl Heyman, I know, has also talked about that sort of element to it, which is also a risk factor. So we unfortunately can't look at it in great detail, but I'm sure there's somebody that probably is. There's, I think, some researchers at AUT as well that are looking more kind of directly at players and risk factors there.
Do we have detailed information about food intake?
Not in the IDI, no. There won't be any sort of good diet or any, if I know of. Yeah.
I haven't heard anything.
No, unlikely to be. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.